happening, and also they were aware of it. They just chose to remedy it in a way that I didn't feel was just.
Mm-hmm.
So like a lot of these people are in these programs, these exchange programs. A lot of them work for for-profit companies, first of all. And then the ones that work in schools are still just like a sort of cog in the wheel of this machine. You know, they're just allowing this to continue.
Perpetuating a cycle that's not changing anything for the poor, right?
Yeah. And some of them are aware of it, but they still do it because it's a living. Like my girlfriend, for instance, she
Mm-hmm.
works in that system, and she does it. And she may argue a different, this is just my point of view, but she may argue a different view, but from what she tells me, her students are predominantly like middle class students from New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of racial undertones in that, class undertones in that. And I didn't like what I was seeing at NYU, so I sort of became disillusioned with the people in my program, and not all of them, they're all like good people, and they all had good intentions, but they were pursuing things that I didn't feel like was gonna best remedy that whole system of oppression.
Mm-hmm.
Like I knew some guys working for like big sort of NGOs, like IRC, and I don't know, World Bank, all these different things that
Mm-hmm.
are supposed to be trying to remedy poverty, but they're not necessarily doing it.
Right. Because, I mean, especially, I mean, I don't know much about our IRC, but I mean, in terms of an organization like World Bank, they're loath. I mean, not loath, but literally by the people whose interests they serve in the final analysis, especially international financiers, they're not gonna make radical structural changes that would be needed to end poverty or provide a thorough education for all, because that would be a threat to the system which
They operate. Yeah.
you know, i.e. capitalism, which is from which they make their profit. So in a sense they're bound by this contradiction.
Yeah, definitely. And then the UN too, like I think the UN is great for people of all nations coming together, but like who is speaking at the UN, who has a voice at the UN,
Yeah.
who controls
Mm-hmm.
the funds of the UN,
Mm-hmm.
predominantly Western, US.
Yeah.
I mean, Russia's got an inordinate amount of
Yeah.
power in that too. And who's invited to the UN? I don't think, still Palestine is not in the UN. They
Mm-hmm.
got recognized by one sort of fringe part of the UN recently, but still not part of the UN. And they're bound by nationhood.
Right, as opposed to the interests of the classes within those nations who, you know, the poor, and this hopefully can be a segue into what you're doing here in Bushwick now. You know, these orphans that you were working with in Tanzania, they were experiencing circumstances that perhaps in some ways are not so far removed from the child of a very poor family, especially a family of color or an immigrant family, right here in this neighborhood of Bushwick. And so I think that's an interesting point you bring up about they're bound to national borders and national agendas, when actually it's not saying, well, look, these poor young people in Tanzania and these poor young people in poor young people in Dar es Salaam and poor young people in Brooklyn, New York, have much more in common than they do with the rich in either country. Wouldn't you say that, Sal?
I would agree with that. I mean, they're both sort of marginalized in their given societies. They're both are limited in terms of political power and power in just guiding their lives to some kind of quality of life.
So Daniel, can you bring that into how these experiences growing up in Santa Paula studying history, being a substitute teacher, and then also studying at NYU for a master's degree, how that has brought you unexpectedly, not to East Africa, but to Bushwick, a place that you, at least for the near term, hope to commit yourself to as an educator. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I mean, Bushwick is sort of like this land of immigrants in Brooklyn, predominantly Dominican and Puerto Rican, but far from just that. I was talking to a girl today. She was Ecuadorian, half Guatemalan.
Wow.
Yeah, and the teen that I work with, she's from Trinidad.
Mm-hmm.
And there's immigrants from a lot of places, and Bushwick is sort of like this neighborhood that's historically been riddled with violence. So like in the 1960s and 1970s, this sort of process of white flight was like in full flux. People were moving out of Bushwick and neighborhoods like Bushwick in New York City and going into the suburbs. And when that happened, there was sort of like this influx of immigrants also coming, predominantly Latino at the time. And most of those Dominicans and Puerto Ricans were coming to neighborhoods like Bushwick. And when they were going there, they were coming to this sort of deindustrialized society where all the businesses were leaving. Bushwick used to be full of beer factories.
Mm-hmm.
And now that all this white flight was occurring, there was no jobs. There weren't any taxes going back into supporting the community.
Mm-hmm.
So the homeowners didn't have any desire or need or profit to keep these buildings, so a lot of them would burn them for their insurance. And because of that, they were just burning basically the homes and the surroundings of people of color, of Dominicans and Puerto Ricans.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just creating a sort of cyclone of poverty. There was nothing for people in this community. And after that, crime was rampant, because once you have no funding for a community, you have poor schools, nobody wants to go there because there's crime. At the same time, crack was going on. You have an epidemic that's just cheap drugs. And also you got this unjust criminal system where people with crack are being arrested and people snorting cocaine aren't being arrested.
Mm-hmm.
And they're being arrested at different levels and being charged at different levels. So you're kind of creating like this prison industrial complex for the people of color in neighborhoods like Bushwick. And it wasn't until the 90s when people in this community started to become aware of that sort of system, and they started to push back a little bit and tried to get rid of the perpetrators of this violence. So they were first targeting criminals and these gang members that were kind of growing out of this like sort of crack epidemic and drug epidemic, heroin too. And when that happened, also you had Rudy Giuliani, I think became mayor, and he sort of like was going to make the streets safe. And he cleaned up Times Square, which Times Square is, you go there now, it looks like a commercial. Whereas if you went there in the 80s and 90s, it was just full of like XXX video stores and prostitution, sex clubs and all these different things. And now you go and you see Disney everywhere and M&M stuff. But when he was doing that, he was also cleaning up the streets of Brooklyn with the NYPD, with all these criminals.
So by cleaning up, he meant he was going to rampantly police the city and clear out, make way for the wealthy to move back in, businesses to move back in, right?
Yeah, and so you had these people with family members that were stuck in this criminal system now, and now you have this wave of like new businesses and sort of like hipster generation in the 2000s starting to move in, and artists. They were coming into a place that was still seen as very dangerous, and the prices were still low, But over time, like over 10 years now, it's 2014, these prices are going up, and now you see this process of gentrification, which happened in Harlem a long time ago, still sort of happening. It's happened in the Bronx, still sort of happening, and now you see it in Bushwick, and you used to be able to get an apartment at Bushwick, like a full apartment for like $600. Now they're like $3,000. It's really like insane price influx, and because of that, families that have been staying here since like the 60s and 70s can't afford it, and they're being evicted from their apartments because rents being risen really, really high, at high rates, illegal rates even, by some property owners, and they're leaving Bushwick. And the families that can afford it, they're still scraping by and they're trying to maintain into their community, while others are sort of like trying to create this new community without asking them, sort of.
So can you kind of narrow in on how where this leaves you as an educator here in Bushwick?
Yeah, so some might look at me my face value and say, oh, you're part of this process of gentrification. And as an individual who's sort of learned and like, okay, I'm from this place, Santa Paula, from this lower working class. I'm schooled in the history of people of color and immigrants and all these different things. I have my master's in this education, and I learned the system that I want to work against. I'm taking all this knowledge that I've acquired and all this experience I've acquired, and I'm going to try to use that to empower the people that are still in this neighborhood and have families that have been here for a long time, or are still migrating to this neighborhood and may not have the privilege as the hipster on the other side that doesn't know about that. So I'm teaching